This is Dana S. Brown from the Geek Girls Academy. It is the end of April by now, which is kind of amazing to me because in my brain somewhere we're still back at almost Christmas, and actually we are almost to school being out in summertime, which is wow, amazing. Time marches on. Today we are going to talk about, in the more you know, we're going to talk about tropes and are tropes trite, which is a fun kind of subject. So what a trope is when you're talking about, books and literature and even into movies and television, that kind of thing. A trope is a plot device, a character, a setting, all of those kinds of things, which is used repeatedly and is used in order to give some indication to the reader as to what the story is about. Okay. That's what a trope is. There are a lot of them. Tropes do tend to be they're very often genre specific, or something that you can say this trope shows up a lot in this particular genre. For example, magical swords that have some kind of a soul that talk to you, magical weapons in general. That's a trope. And that shows up all the time in fantasy and sometimes in science fiction and sometimes in magical realism in those kinds of genres. They're not going to show up so much in, contemporary romance because contemporary romance by definition doesn't tend to have the fantastical in it. So it's not a trope that would be a contemporary romance trope, but it's totally a trope that you would say is a speculative fiction trope to have a magical weapon of some sort. So that's a trope. Okay. The thing that people get onto is they get into this idea where they say tropes are stupid. I'm not going to use any in my book because a trope is trite. A trope it's only because you're not creative enough to do something else. That is not true. A trope becomes trite when it is used repeatedly to the point that it doesn't even make sense anymore. And there is a good example of this is actually sometimes in language. So there's a film called Get Shorty, and I actually haven't ever watched it, but friends of mine laughed about it because they said this is one of those films where they use the F-bomb so much that it becomes silly. It doesn't have any punch to it. It doesn't become, because now they're using it in incorrect places. They're using it all the time to a point that it's silly. And then the movie itself starts pointing that out, that, yeah, we're doing this on purpose, that usually this hard hitting, impactful swear word now has almost no impact because we have taken it to such an extreme that it doesn't hit you anymore because it's nothing different. Um, so that kind of thing can be when a trope becomes trite. And we'll see this sometimes also in the way that the industry lanes. So people will say, oh my gosh, everything I have seen in young adult in the last X number of months has been a love triangle. I am so sick of love triangles. I hate them. And in that case, that trope has now become trite. Now, the interesting thing is that there's a lot of personal preference in that. Because you may say, I have seen so many love triangles that I hate them. I'm so done with them. But there's still a whole audience who goes, actually, that's my very, very favorite trope. I will read all books with love triangles in them forever and always. Amen. So it is very personal. And it can be a trend in the market where you get enough people that really love that trope that it keeps it alive and well, even when you have other people who are pulling back from it. So yes, we can look at lots of things, and one group of people say it's overdone, and one group of people will say, no, I will always read that. And other people are just discovering that trope for the first time and deciding how they feel about it. This is why books can be so evergreen, is because that market cycles and shifts, and something that was really popular at one point will be popular again, maybe with a slightly different twist to it, but it's going to come back. I was talking with friends the other day, and we're starting to see kind of a resurgence of books like Twilight, which went through a big period where it was really, really hot and lots of energy around it. And then it kind of moved into a background place. But now you're getting kids that are reaching that age that Twilight really associates well with, and they're discovering it for the first time. Okay, so that trope and everything they did in Twilight might have aged out for older readers, but now you've got newer ones coming in, and so those tropes are becoming rediscovered, and they're looking for other books like this. And there you are, it's back again. It's why things like magical schools, Harry Potter was not the first magical school. They won't be the last. And they go in that loop of, oh, it's really, really big and everybody knows about it. And then there's lots and lots and lots of magical school books out there, and people get kind of tired of it. And you see other things that come up as it goes down. But this is going to come back up. So it's very important to be aware of tropes, to be aware of tropes that are commonly used in your genre, because the other thing a trope gives you is shorthand. So when somebody sees that magical weapon, they know what kind of story this is going to be. Now you can put your own could and should. I'm going to use the should would, even though Becca Syme says we don't say should. And she's amazing, by the way. If you want, somebody who I would encourage that you follow that makes your publishing journey better, Becca Symes is amazeballs. You can find her over the Quickcast. But um, you really need to understand those tropes because you can use them for a shorthand. You can use them in marketing to get people over to your books because they love the thing that you wrote about. You can use it to tell people what to expect. So if I talk about there's a magical weapon in the blurb, they're already going to know to expect, well, there's going to be a magical weapon. It might be good. It might be evil. It might get them into trouble. It might be something that they've got to take to Mordor and throw into the mountain into Mount Doom. It sets up all these expectations, but even within those expectations, there's still a lot of range to write. But it tells people that if I love this kind of story, I'm probably going to love your book and I'm going to buy it. And if they get it and they say, oh, really, really not into single dad stories, then they may look at it and go, I'm going to go for a different one of your books. I'm going to go for something that doesn't use this particular trope. So tropes do give you that shorthand for marketing to draw in the audience who loves those things or who wants to experience them for the first time. So it is not bad for you to do that. It is not bad for you to have, most books will have multiple tropes in it. Do not what we call trope stuff, which is when you go and you go to Google and you say, what are the top 10 tropes in romance this year? And then you say, I will take all 10 of these and shove them and shoehorn them into my book. Don't do that. That just gets silly. And then you've got too much going on and your readers get confused. But you may find that there are 2 or 3 things that really you can do. So like I've got a romance it's a small town romance. It is a single dad with kids romance, and it deals with the subject of infertility and found family. Okay. So those are all tropes that I can say for readers who like that kind of thing. This is what's going to be in this book. I think you're really going to enjoy it. Sometimes when you're doing cross genre, you will end up with more tropes in there. So like if you're doing young adult fantasy, you're going to have some fantasy tropes that show up, and then you're also going to have some young adult tropes that show up. Things like, 17-year-olds saving the world, which that's a trope that I personally start getting sad about because I'm old enough now that I don't want a 17-year-old to be in charge. I remember being 17 and I was way too dumb to be in charge. But that's a really strong trope in YA is that the kids have to come to the rescue. That's why it's YA. They have to be the main characters. Okay, so you combine that then with some fantasy tropes, and that's where you get your YA fantasy. So crossover genres are going to pull more tropes from each side and kind of bring them together so that you get a book that is going to appeal to that wider audience. So if you want to know how to find tropes, because people will say, well, I don't know what kinds of things to expect. The first thing you do is you're reading your genre, okay? And people say, well, I don't have time for reading. There's a lot of different ways to read. There's a lot of different ways to take in creativity and to look at these things. You can do this. You really, really can. Sometimes you have to read in the corners. So that may mean read short fiction in your genre. There are great anthologies out there that can still encapsulate the ideas and the tropes that you're going to see in the wider genre. So maybe your reading time is spent reading urban fantasy shorts instead of reading urban fantasy series. Or it's reading other things. But as you read in your genre, you're going to see these things that keep coming up, especially in books that are selling well, that tells you there's an audience for it. There's an audience that loves that trope, right? So if you can't read, you can go to Google and you can ask it, what are the top 10 tropes? And you're going to find bloggers and people who have made comments on this. Big grain of salt, okay, because if they're wrong and they're not hitting right on, you might have a problem with your audience. Most of the time, you're going to be able to get a sense of that. You can also go to K-Lytics. Alex Newton's reports will break out tropes that are being seen in specific genres. And his study is on the top 100 bestsellers. So he's always going to pull off of those books that are selling. They have an audience. So if he says in 89 of these books, we had werewolf shifters, that's a hot trope, probably right. So he's another good place to go. So there's a lot of resources there. And then you can just talk to people who like the genre. Hopefully you love it if you're writing there anyway, so you're going to know. But go to reader groups and say, what are some of the things that you really, really love in your books or that you're not seeing enough of? Maybe there's a trope that is underused and that there's an audience who is just really, really into it and wants your book because you're going to give them that. Please give them that. It makes them very happy. So tropes don't have to be trite. Just don't overuse them and make sure that you are using the kinds of tropes that your audience expects for your genre. And you're going to find that things tend to work out just fine. All right, guys, get those pencils going. We have lots of books we want to read. We will see you later. Thanks from the Geek Girls Academy.